While Hood's brigade earned glory and suffered catastrophic losses in Virginia, thousands of other Texans were fighting a very different kind of war in the West. In Tennessee, Kentucky, Mississippi, and Georgia, the conflict was characterized by rapid cavalry raids, river battles for control of the Mississippi, and sprawling campaigns across vast distances. The Western theater was where Texas cavalry truly shined. These were men who had grown up in the saddle, who could ride all day and fight all night, who knew horses the way sailors knew ships. They brought with them the tactics and weapons of the Texas frontier: multiple revolvers instead of sabers, shotguns for close-range devastation, and a willingness to charge headlong into enemy fire. The most famous of these cavalry units was the 8th Texas Cavalry, but history would remember them by a different name: Terry's Texas Rangers. The 8th Texas Cavalry was formed in Houston in September 1861 under the command of Colonel Benjamin Franklin Terry, a wealthy sugar planter who had helped found the unit. From the beginning, Terry's Rangers were different from traditional cavalry. Most cavalry units of the era were trained to fight like European cavalry, charging with sabers, using horses primarily for mobility, but fighting in formation. Terry's Rangers rejected this approach entirely. They were Texas horsemen, and they fought the Texas way. Each Ranger carried multiple Colt revolvers, usually 2, sometimes 3 or 4. They also carried double-barreled shotguns, deadly at close range. The saber, the traditional cavalry weapon, was considered almost useless by these men. As one Ranger put it, "A revolver in each hand is worth a dozen sabers." Their tactics were simple but terrifying. Ride hard, get close, unleash massive firepower at point-blank range, then wheel and charge again. They hit like a thunderbolt and disappeared like smoke. Private John Barker, a young Ranger from Austin, might have written home, "We don't fight like the fancy cavalry you read about in books. We ride fast, shoot straight, and make the Yankees wish they'd stayed home." Colonel Terry says we're shock cavalry. We hit them before they know what's happening. The Rangers' first major engagement came in December 1861 at Woodsonville, Kentucky. It was a small battle, barely a footnote in most histories, but it set the pattern for everything that followed, and it cost the Rangers their founding commander. Confederate forces were attempting to disrupt Union operations in Kentucky when they encountered a Union cavalry force. Colonel Terry, leading from the front as always, ordered his Rangers to charge. The Texans thundered forward, revolvers blazing. The Union cavalry, expecting a traditional mounted fight, were completely unprepared for the fury of the assault. Rangers rode right into the enemy formation, firing with both hands, shotguns roaring at close range. The noise was tremendous, the confusion total. The Union cavalry broke and ran, but the victory came at a terrible price. Colonel Benjamin Terry, leading the charge, was shot from his saddle and killed instantly. The regiment had lost its founder in its very first battle. The men were devastated. Many wanted to name the unit Terry's Texas Rangers in his honor, and the name stuck. From that day forward, they would be Terry's Rangers, and they would carry his memory into every fight. Command passed to Colonel Thomas Lubbock, who would lead the regiment until his death in 1862, and then to Colonel John Wharton. But no matter who commanded, the Rangers remained true to the aggressive, hard-charging style Terry had established. Terry's Rangers fought in virtually every major engagement in the Western theater: Shiloh, Perryville, Stones River, Chickamauga, and dozens of smaller battles and raids. They earned a reputation that made Union commanders wary. One of their most famous exploits came at the Battle of Stones River, Murfreesboro, in December 1862. During a Confederate attack, the Rangers executed a thundering charge that smashed through Union lines and resulted in the capture of Union Brigadier General August Willich, a Prussian-born professional soldier. When General Willich realized who had captured him, that he had been taken prisoner by Texas cavalry, he reportedly said something that would become part of Ranger lore. "I had rather be a private in that regiment than to be a brigadier general in the Federal Army." Whether he actually said those exact words or whether the Rangers embellished the story over campfires, it doesn't really matter. The quote captured how the Rangers saw themselves, as an elite force of mounted warriors who could defeat anyone, anywhere. Union General William T. Sherman, Uncle Billy to his troops, the devil to Confederates, had his own opinion of Terry's Rangers. He reportedly called them the most dangerous set of men which the war turned loose upon the world. Coming from Sherman, that was both an insult and a grudging compliment. What made Terry's Rangers so effective was their complete rejection of conventional cavalry doctrine. They understood that the revolver had changed mounted warfare forever. In a traditional cavalry charge with sabers, each man got one strike, one chance to slash at an enemy as he rode past. But with multiple revolvers, a ranger could fire 12 shots or more in a single charge, reloading as he wheeled his horse for another pass. The psychological impact was enormous. Imagine being a Union soldier standing in formation when suddenly you hear the thunder of hooves and see Texas cavalry bearing down on you. As they close, you realize they're not drawing sabers, they're pulling out multiple revolvers. Then the shooting starts, a continuous rolling crash of gunfire from dozens of weapons, all firing at once. Many Union units simply broke and ran rather than face a Ranger charge. Those who stood and fought often regretted it. A Union soldier who survived a clash with the Rangers wrote in his diary, "They came at us like demons, screaming and firing with both hands. I have never seen anything like it. We fired volleys at them, but they just kept coming. It was like trying to stop a hurricane with a fence." As the war dragged on, Terry's Rangers, like all Confederate units, began to wear down. Horses became scarce, good cavalry mounts were worth their weight in gold, and the South simply couldn't replace them as fast as they were killed or worn out. Men were harder to replace too. The original Rangers from 1861 were dying in battle or succumbing to disease, and the replacements, while brave, often lacked the training and experience of the originals. By 1865, the Rangers were shadows of what they had been. They fought on through Georgia during Sherman's devastating march, harassing his forces whenever they could, but they couldn't stop the Union juggernaut. When the war finally ended, many Rangers simply rode away rather than formally surrender. They had started the war as volunteers, and they ended it the same way, doing what they thought was right, not what they were ordered to do. The 8th Texas Cavalry officially disbanded in May 1865, but Terry's Rangers never really ended. They lived on in the memories of the men who survived and in the nightmares of the Union soldiers who had faced them. While Terry's Rangers roamed across Tennessee and Georgia, other Texas units were fighting different battles. In Mississippi, along the great river that both sides knew was crucial to victory, a Texas unit was about to perform one of the most daring counterattacks of the entire war. Vicksburg, Mississippi sat on high bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River. Whoever controlled Vicksburg controlled the river, and whoever controlled the river would effectively cut the Confederacy in two. In the spring of 1863, Union General Ulysses S. Grant began a siege of the city that would last for weeks and would eventually starve the defenders into submission. Defending part of the Vicksburg line was Waul's Texas Legion, a unit recruited from across Texas and commanded by General Thomas Neville Waul. They manned a fortification called the Railroad Redoubt, an earthwork fort that protected the Southern Railroad of Mississippi where it entered the city. On May 22, 1863, Grant ordered a massive assault all along the Vicksburg defenses. He hoped to overwhelm the Confederates and take the city by storm, rather than wait for starvation to do the work. Union soldiers, carrying ladders and fascines, bundles of sticks to fill ditches, charged toward the Railroad Redoubt in a human wave. Confederate artillery and rifle fire tore into them, but they kept coming. Some reached the fort's walls, planted ladders, and began climbing. Union engineers managed to set off an explosion that blew a hole in the redoubt's wall. Through the gap, Union soldiers poured into the fort and raised the United States flag. For a moment, it looked like the Railroad Redoubt would fall. General Waul realized that if the redoubt was lost, the entire Confederate line might collapse. He called for volunteers to counterattack and retake the fort, a desperate and extremely dangerous mission. Captain L.D. Bradley of Waul's Legion stepped forward. So did Lieutenant Colonel Edmund Pettus of the 46th Alabama. They quickly gathered a small storming party, 30 Texans and 3 Alabamians, just 33 men total. But they faced a critical problem. Confederate troops outside the fort were still firing into it to suppress the Union soldiers inside. To rush the fort, the counterattack party would have to approach from behind while their own side was shooting at the position. They'd be caught between Confederate fire from behind and Union fire from inside the fort. Pettus came up with a solution. He pulled out a red bandana, the kind cowboys use to keep dust out of their faces. He would climb up where Confederate troops could see him and throw down the bandana as a signal to stop firing. The instant the firing stopped, the 33 men would rush the fort before the Union troops inside could react. It was a bold plan. It was also insane. Everything depended on split-second timing. Pettus climbed into position where Confederate troops could see him clearly. He held up the red bandana, making sure the signal was understood, then threw it down. The Confederate firing stopped. In the sudden silence, the 33 men rushed forward, scrambling over the damaged wall and into the fort. The Union soldiers inside had been keeping their heads down to avoid the Confederate fire from outside. They were still crouched behind cover when Texas and Alabama soldiers appeared among them, shooting revolvers at point-blank range and jabbing with bayonets. The shock was total. Before the Union troops could organize a defense, it was over. The counterattack succeeded in driving the Union soldiers out of the fort. Incredibly, not a single member of the 33-man storming party was killed or even wounded. They captured 33 Union prisoners, exactly 1 prisoner per Confederate attacker, and reclaimed the Railroad Redoubt. The red bandana signal had worked perfectly. The Confederate line was saved, at least for that day. The siege of Vicksburg would continue for another 6 weeks. On July 4th, 1863, the same day that Lee's defeated army was retreating from Gettysburg, Vicksburg finally surrendered. Waul's Legion became prisoners of war, but they had fought with distinction until the very end. The story of the red bandana counterattack would be told and retold wherever Texas veterans gathered after the war. Another example of Texas courage and tactical creativity in the face of overwhelming odds. While Hood's brigade was fighting in Virginia and Terry's Rangers were riding across Tennessee, another group of Texans was attempting something far more ambitious and ultimately far more disastrous: the conquest of the American Southwest. Brigadier General Henry Hopkins Sibley had a grand vision. He would lead a brigade of Texas mounted rifles, cavalry, and mounted infantry west from San Antonio, conquer New Mexico territory, seize the Colorado goldfields, and possibly even reach California. The Confederacy would stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and the South would have all the resources it needed to win the war. On paper, the plan looked feasible. New Mexico had a small Union garrison, and the local population was divided in its loyalties. Sibley's Texans were tough, experienced frontiersmen who could handle the harsh desert environment. What could go wrong? Everything. In the winter of 1861 to 1862, approximately 3,000 Texans began the long march from San Antonio to New Mexico. The 4th, 5th, and 7th Texas Mounted Rifles formed the core of Sibley's brigade, along with several artillery batteries. At first, things went well. The Texans fought and won several small battles against Union forces pushing north along the Rio Grande. They occupied Albuquerque and Santa Fe, the territorial capital. The plan seemed to be working. But there were warning signs. Supplies were running low. The harsh New Mexico winter was harder than expected. And General Sibley himself was proving to be a poor commander. On March 28, 1862, Sibley's brigade encountered Union forces at Glorieta Pass, a narrow canyon in the mountains southeast of Santa Fe. It was a natural choke point, and whoever controlled it would control access to northern New Mexico. The Texans attacked with their usual aggressiveness, pushing the Union troops back through the pass. In the tactical fighting on the battlefield itself, the Confederates won. They drove the Union forces back and held the field at the end of the day. But while the battle raged in the pass, disaster struck in the Confederate rear. A Union force under Major John Chivington had circled around behind the Texas position. They discovered something that would doom the entire campaign. The Confederate supply train, parked in a canyon and guarded by only a small detachment. Chivington's men descended on the supply wagons like wolves on a flock of sheep. They burned all 80 wagons, every bit of food, ammunition, medical supplies, and equipment the Texans had. They also bayoneted several hundred mules so the Confederates couldn't use them to haul new supplies. When the victorious Texans returned from the battlefield, they found their entire supply train destroyed. Without supplies, in hostile territory, with winter still gripping the mountains, Sibley had no choice but to retreat. The march back to Texas would become one of the most miserable experiences of the entire war. The Texans were starving. They were freezing at night and baking during the day. They had no medicine for the sick and wounded. They were hundreds of miles from friendly territory, and every mile of the journey was agony. Soldiers' diaries from the retreat make for grim reading. Men wrote about eating their horses when they died, about comrades who simply gave up and sat down beside the trail to die, about the burning thirst in the desert and the bitter cold in the mountains. And then there was General Sibley himself. According to accounts from the 4th Texas Mounted Rifles, Sibley spent much of the retreat drunk, riding in a wagon while his men walked. Whether these accounts were entirely accurate or partially exaggerated by bitter, suffering men, the fact remains that Sibley's soldiers had lost all respect for him. One soldier wrote in his diary that Sibley was a coward and a drunkard. Others called him worse. By the time the survivors straggled back into San Antonio in the late spring of 1862, the brigade had been shattered. Of the 3,000 men who had marched west with such high hopes, hundreds were dead, hundreds more were sick or wounded, and virtually all were demoralized. The dream of a Confederate empire stretching to the Pacific died in the mountains and deserts of New Mexico. It was Texas's greatest strategic defeat of the war, a complete disaster that accomplished nothing and cost dearly. While Sibley's campaign ended in 1862, Texas troops continued to fight in the West throughout the war. Perhaps the most tragic story belongs to Granbury's Texas Brigade, which would meet its end in one of the most controversial battles of the entire conflict. Hiram Granbury was a lawyer and businessman from Waco who became one of the most respected Confederate generals from Texas. His brigade, composed of the 6th, 7th, 10th, 15th, 17th, 18th, 24th, and 25th Texas Infantry Regiments, along with the 7th Texas Cavalry, dismounted, fought in the Western Theater with distinction. They participated in the defense of Vicksburg, fought at Chickamauga, and served in the Army of Tennessee under General Joseph E. Johnston. The soldiers loved Granbury. He was competent, he cared about his men, and he led from the front. But in late 1864, Granbury's brigade found itself under the command of a different general with a very different approach to warfare, John Bell Hood, the same Hood who had commanded Hood's Texas Brigade in Virginia before losing the use of his arm at Gettysburg. Hood had been promoted to command the entire Army of Tennessee, and he decided on a desperate strategy: invade Tennessee, threaten Nashville, and try to force Union General Sherman to abandon his march through Georgia. It was a plan born of desperation, and it would lead to catastrophe. On November 30th, 1864, Hood's army reached Franklin, Tennessee, and discovered Union forces entrenched behind strong fortifications. The Union position was nearly perfect for defense: good fields of fire, solid earthworks, veteran troops. Hood's subordinate generals begged him not to attack. They pointed out that a frontal assault across open ground against fortified positions would be suicide. They suggested flanking maneuvers or waiting for better opportunities. Hood refused. He was convinced that his army needed a morale-boosting victory, and he believed that Southern fighting spirit could overcome any obstacle. He ordered a direct frontal assault. As the sun began to set on that November afternoon, approximately 20,000 Confederate soldiers, including Granbury's Texas Brigade, formed into lines and prepared to advance. General Hiram Granbury rode along his lines, encouraging his men. He knew what was coming. They all knew what was coming. But orders were orders, and the Texas Brigade had never refused to attack when called upon. "Boys," Granbury might have told them, "we've got hard work ahead, but we're Texans, and Texans don't run. We go forward, and we go together. Take care of each other, aim true, and we'll get through this." The men checked their rifles, fixed bayonets, and waited for the order. When the command came, the Confederate line surged forward across nearly 2 miles of open ground toward the Union fortifications. It must have been an awesome and terrible sight. Thousands of men in gray and butternut advancing in lines, battle flags waving, officers on horseback, the whole mass moving forward like a storm rolling across the landscape. Union artillery opened fire. Shells exploded in the advancing ranks, tearing gaps in the lines. The Confederates closed the gaps and kept moving. Union infantry opened fire with rifles and repeating weapons. The crash of gunfire was continuous, like tearing cloth that never stopped. Men fell by the dozens, by the hundreds, but the survivors kept advancing. Some Confederate units actually reached the Union fortifications and fought hand-to-hand in the trenches. The battle became a brutal, close-quarters brawl where men clubbed and stabbed and shot each other at a distance of inches. But courage wasn't enough. The Union position was too strong, the defenders too numerous. The Confederate attack was doomed from the start. General Hiram Granbury was killed leading the charge, shot down while advancing toward the enemy lines. General Patrick Cleburne, one of the finest Confederate generals and a close friend of many Texans, also fell. In all, 6 Confederate generals were killed or mortally wounded at Franklin, an almost unprecedented loss of leadership in a single battle. After the battle, the bodies of Granbury, Cleburne, and 3 other Confederate generals were laid out on the back porch of Carnton Plantation House, which had been turned into a makeshift hospital. The officers who came to pay their respects wept openly. These were not just generals. They were friends, mentors, leaders who had earned the love and respect of their men. Outside, the battlefield was a nightmare landscape. Approximately 7,000 Confederate soldiers were casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. In some places, bodies were stacked 3 and 4 deep. Granbury's Texas Brigade had been shattered. The unit that had fought so well at Chickamauga and other battles effectively ceased to exist as a cohesive fighting force. The survivors would continue to serve, but they would never recover from Franklin. A young Texan, wounded in the charge and lying in the hospital, might have whispered to a nurse, "We did what we were told. We went forward. We reached their lines, but there were too many of them, and they had too much iron. General Granbury, he died leading us. He died like a man. We all tried to die like men." The Texas units that fought in the Western Theater, Terry's Rangers, Waul's Legion, Sibley's Brigade, Granbury's Brigade, and dozens of smaller units, faced challenges very different from those encountered by Hood's Texas Brigade in Virginia. They fought across vast distances and harsh terrain. They dealt with supply problems that were even worse than those in the East. They served under commanders who ranged from brilliant to incompetent, and they often fought in battles that have been largely forgotten by history, overshadowed by the great Eastern battles like Gettysburg and Antietam. But they fought with the same courage, the same determination, and they paid the same price in blood. They charged when ordered, held when told to hold, and died when their number came up, just like their brothers in Virginia. By early 1865, the Western Theater was collapsing. Sherman's march through Georgia had cut the Confederacy in half. Nashville was lost after the disaster at Franklin. The Mississippi River had been under Union control since Vicksburg fell in 1863. Texas units, what was left of them, began the long retreat back toward Texas. Some made it, many didn't. And back in Texas, the last chapter of the state's Civil War story was about to be written, in a place that most Americans had never heard of, and in a battle that would change nothing, but would, in its own strange way, symbolize everything Texas had been during the war: defiant, aggressive, and unwilling to quit, even when defeat was inevitable. Be sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next video in this series, when we'll witness the final land battle of the Civil War at Palmito Ranch, Texas, a Confederate victory fought after the war was already over. A fitting end to Texas's strange and contradictory role in America's bloodiest conflict. If you have anything you'd like to see us cover, please let us know in the comments. Until next time, stay curious.